We've grown used to thinking we live in an age of solved mysteries. The ticker of discovery races faster than the newsfeed. Artificial intelligence, Mars missions, artificial hearts, robot humanoids. The world seems to play in a major key. Civilization has triumphed and all evil is behind us. But beneath that major chord, there is a background hum that still lacks an explanation. A sound not heard by ears, but recorded by instruments across decades. Earth hum, a low-frequency vibration, constant, global. From Greenland to New Zealand, sensors pick up the same faint, persistent signal. Always there, even when the planet is still. Some call it explained oceanic waves, seismic resonance, energy caught between crust and sky. But its rhythm remains. Too precise, too constant, too persistent to dismiss. A phenomenon still lacking a complete explanation. Upsweep is the second anomaly, a deep underwater sound in the Pacific, appearing like clockwork every autumn and fading each spring. Scientists chart the data. They check for earthquakes, magma shifts, ocean currents, glacial melt. Nothing matches. No natural mechanism explains the timing, the range, or the rhythm. These are not myths, these are readings. Logged, archived, analyzed, and still unanswered. 4,000 years ago, the resplendent Sumerian center of priests, scribes, and mathematicians, believed itself built to last forever. It raised stepped ziggurats, maintained meticulous tablet records of barley and copper, tracked solar cycles, and traded wool from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. But that confidence cracked suddenly. Not slowly, not gently, but with a blow from the north. Clay tablets, scorched by fire, preserved stark lines written after the fall. The strong and the weak of fell to hunger. Mothers who did not leave their homes burned in the fire. Infants lying in their arms were swept away like fish by water. The heads of men struck down by axe lay exposed. Their mouths, like a gazelle in a trap, bit the dust. O city, your name still remains, but you no longer exist. Lamentation over circa 20th century BCE. The reign of Ibbi-Sin coincided with the salinization of fields due to over-irrigation, crop failures, and successive droughts. With granaries emptied, the city was left vulnerable, and in the autumn of the 20th century BCE, nomadic Amorites breached its walls. Fire swept through the temples, and the royal Third Dynasty of vanished from the list of powers. Without fortresses, there are no sieges, and thus no reason to linger. Gray herds of steppe riders rolled across the Caucasus, scorched the abandoned Median villages, and reached the coast. The chronicles remembered a single night. Torches fell on the Ashkelon spit, and the temple of Aphrodite burst into flame like dry reeds. Archaeologists uncovered a fire wedge from the 7th century BCE in the city's embankment and a layer of charred limestone. A local record adds, "The flame came from the sea and left toward the steppe. The fiery trace rolled southward but never lingered longer than a single night. The Scythians struck like a horse's bite and vanished, leaving behind no garrison, only a bitter memory." The scribes of Assyria borrowed the Sumerian lament formula, "Storm after storm swept the land," and substituted a new name, Ishkuzai. 28 years later, Herodotus would count Scythian dominion faded as quietly as it had flared. Those who survived the raids never knew who they had faced. Barbarians from the north, a cloud of horses, those whose graves themselves do not stay in place. The rhythm remains unchanged. Approach, flame, void. Tablets unearthed beneath Hattusa's fallen ramparts speak not of a conqueror's name, but of walls that melted like wax beneath a red wind. In the palace archive, excavators found a last royal communique, its wedge marks blistered and incomplete, still pinned beneath vitrified beams. Later, Neo-Assyrian chroniclers would reduce the disaster to a single rubric: Hatti became smoke. The ash stratum is laced with glass-fused sandstone and collapsed bronze fittings, proof of a fire so bright that, legend says, the embers were seen from the Pontic steppe. By dawn, The thousand-gated citadel lay mute. The road to Hadi echoed only with wind and drifting soot. Hattusa, Ashkelon. Each city thought itself the center of the world, until it heard the rustle of hooves and the silence that followed. In the historian's notes, only one line remains. Your name still exists, but you no longer do. Half a millennium after the fall of and the smoldering of Hattusa, the northern steppe once again entered the chronicles. On the banks of the Araxes, the nomadic Queen Tomyris accepted the challenge of the Persian king and answered with her own law of war. As I promised, so I do. I give you your fill of blood. When Cyrus's body was found among the fallen, she lowered his severed head into a sack made of leather, filled with human blood, and repeated the oath she had sworn before the battle. So recounts Herodotus. In Greek retellings, it sounds like a fearsome ritual, but the Massagetæ, kin to the northern Scythians, had always lived without cities or farmland, and thus had no reason to occupy what they destroyed. To contemporaries, their raid was not a conquest, but a storm of retribution. It struck, fed, and vanished. Even later, Persian chronicles leave Cyrus's death cloaked in the shadows of legend. What may seem like a savage invention, bathing a head in enemy blood, echoes customs of the Scythian world. Herodotus, describing their laws of war, wrote, "A Scythian who kills his first enemy drinks a drop of his blood. Many he scalps, and the skin of the enemy's head he turns into a cloth, hung on his horse's bridle." For a long time, this was dismissed as hyperbole, until paleoproteomics confirmed that preserved Scythian quivers indeed contained human skin. When Tomyris's funeral pyres faded on the banks of the Araxes and Cyrus's body turned to dust in the steppe, Scythian storytellers whispered of lands beyond the feathergrass, where no one plows, no cities rise. Only strange tribes dwell, whose very name makes the voice falter. Herodotus tells of the first among them, the Isidones, like this. When a father dies, they dismember him, mix his flesh with horse meat, and share the feast. It was a funerary rite in which the body of a chieftain returned to the tribe, and his skull was turned into a gleaming cup. At Scythian-type sites east of the Urals, archaeologists have indeed found skulls with cleanly cut domes. Memorial chalices, just like those the ancient writer may have imagined from stories told by steppe nomads. Further beyond the lands of the Isidones, Herodotus places the Arimaspi, one-eyed men. He notes that this legend was passed from the Isidones to the Scythians, and from the Scythians to the Greeks. For nomads, the name Arimaspu, one eye, became the perfect marker at the edge of the map. Beyond that horizon, they believed, began the long winter. Still farther north lived the Androphags, man-eaters. Herodotus clarifies, they were the only people in the region who practiced not ritual, but routine consumption of human flesh. In 7 earthen forts attributed to the Androphags, cooking pits have yielded human bones with chop marks mixed in with animal remains, a cold confirmation of the account left in the 5th century BCE. Beyond the forest of black cloaks stood the encampments of the Melanchthoni, a people always dressed in darkness. Not Scythians, yet nomadic in the same way. The steppe tribes avoided their fires, believing that anyone who slept in a Melanchthon hide would dream of death. No monsters, only people who wore mourning as their tribal color, and thus seemed doubly alien. Even farther north, near the stagnant marshes, Herodotus places the Nuri, sorcerers who become wolves once a year. Modern ethnographers suggest this may refer to a winter hunting rite with wolfskins and masks, perhaps linked to the totemic cults of forest-dwelling Finno-Ugric peoples. For a Scythian, it was enough to glimpse a fur-hooded silhouette against the moonlight to whisper, "They transform." The steppe riders did not build walls against these northerners. They built a boundary of silence. Herodotus concludes, beyond them lies a desert, and beyond that, no tribe and no trail. With those words, the nomad marks the boundary of his fear and keeps it just beyond the horizon. Monologues of cannibals and black-cloaked tribes sound exaggerated, until the archaeologist lifts from the clay a fragment of a skull cup or a razor-sharp bone knife. And then it turns out, behind every vivid stroke in the ancient chronicles stands not a metaphor, but a very real human choice: to make a skull into a goblet, to wear grief forever, or, like Tomyris, to fill a sack with enemy blood and vanish into the northern wind. Centuries passed. Across those same scorched lands rode a Macedonian king, shields glinting where flames once raged. The alpha version of the Alexander romance opens with Alexander's swift victory over King Darius and a lightning campaign through Asia Minor and Egypt toward Gaugamela, where he broke the horns of the Persian bull. After taking Babylon and founding a riverside Alexandria, the hero drives his army all the way to the Gangetic Plains. Beyond the Indus, the same text says, he received the water of peace, a sign that no further lands remained to conquer, only the edge of the world. But on the march back west, Alexander hears of northern raiders, and in 329 BC, makes a decisive dash to the Yaxartes. The catapults cleared the far bank, and the river was taken. On the left bank, he lays the foundations of a forward base that legend at once calls Alexandria Ashata, the farthest. From this point, the narrative splits. One branch of the romance omits any mention of the wall altogether and is only half as long. Another is a Christian Syriac version attested as early as the 6th century CE, which, among other things, introduces Gog and Magog, a people hostile to humankind. In that version, an elder of a frontier settlement speaks to the king, and then, in a voice that seems half remembered and half feared, he describes Gog and Magog tribes and what they do when they go to war. Some of them have blue eyes, and their women have but one breast apiece, and the women fight more than the men, for they wound a man with knives. They hang knives upon their thighs and arms and necks, so that if one of them should get into a fight, wherever she stretches out her hand, she can lay hold of a knife. They wear dressed skins, and they eat the raw flesh of everything which dies of theirs. When they go forth to war, they fetch and pile up a fire in front of the fire within her. Then they lay it in a trough and throw water upon it. Melts away in this water. And they take their swords and bows and arrows and spears and dip them in this water. And to everyone whom this water touches, it appears as if there were 100,000 horsemen with him. And by the side of every 100 men, there seem to stand 100,000 bands of demons, for their sorceries are greater than those of all kingdoms. The terror of the nations Gog and Magog lies upon every living being, for they have no love for humankind. The legend adds, when he heard this, Alexander commanded that iron be set between the two cliffs, molten copper poured over it, and the name of the Most High sealed upon it, so that the man-eating nations would not emerge, until the moment decreed by God. Gog and Magog are no late invention. Their very names echo some of the oldest prophecies. As early as the 6th century BCE, the book of Ezekiel warns, "You will rise like a storm. You will sweep over the land like a whirlwind." Many generations afterward, the Qumran war scroll 1st century BCE still ranks the hosts of the sons of Gog among the eschatological armies of darkness. The Greco-Roman Sibylline oracles of the 2nd century BCE mention these names again. Therefore, the legendary conversation between the elder and Alexander becomes a junction of epics. The great commander builds not merely a bulwark against the northern barbarians, but a shield against the looming apocalypse. By ordering iron to be set between the stones, he raises not an ordinary wall, but an apocalyptic barrier that, according to prophecy, still awaits its hour. Centuries later, when the Meccan chieftains of Quraysh began to doubt the messenger of God, peace be upon him, they traveled to the learned Jews of Yathrib and asked, "Give us questions that will expose him if he is an impostor." The rabbis proposed 3 mysteries unknown to the Arabs: the story of the youths of the cave, the nature of the soul, and the journey of the two-horned ruler. The Quraysh returned, posed the questions, and the Almighty then revealed the chapter, the cave, where it says, "And they ask you about Dhul-Qarnayn," which means the two-horned ruler. The prophet related that Dhul-Qarnayn first reached the place where the sun sets and appears to sink into a dark spring, the western edge of the land, perhaps the shore of a distant sea or the Caspian lowlands. He then traveled presumably eastward to a land where the people had no shelter from the sun, a country under open sky, recalling a treeless steppe or an extreme northern latitude where the polar day scorches the horizon. Thus the Qur'an corrects the old Greek romance about a land of perpetual darkness. The passage speaks not of gloom, but of a borderland awash in excessive light. From there Dhul-Qarnayn came between two barriers, and the people pleaded, "Gog and Magog are spreading corruption. Set a barrier between us and them." He ordered, "Bring me great plates of iron." He built the wall, packed the gaps with fire, and poured molten copper over it. When the work was finished, he declared, "This is a mercy from my Lord. Yet when my Lord's promise comes, he will grind it to dust." The Quran teaches that the barrier stands not by human power, but by divine mercy, and it will fall only at the hour God appoints. For Muslims, this version, transmitted by the Prophet and preserved unchanged, remains the definitive word on Gog, Magog, and the iron barrier separating them from the world. Nevertheless, the Quran never names Alexander directly. Instead, it speaks of the one with two horns, echoing the horn crown that, since Bronze Age Mesopotamia, had signified royal might and was adopted by many Near Eastern, and later Hellenistic, kings. Narratives that echo the Gog and Magog motif, however, surface in traditions that may predate Alexander the Great. Hindu lore, for example, speaks of the Kalakeyas, demonic tribe who dwell underground, gorge on human flesh, and bide their time until the end of the Kali Yuga. The earliest written references appear in Book 3, Vana Parva, and Book 12, Shanti Parva, of the Mahabharata, a text whose layered composition is usually placed between the 4th century BCE and the 4th century CE. Similar legends are not confined to India. Far to the north, beneath peat mounds and the packed Arctic permafrost, the Yakuts of Siberia preserve a memory that closed tribes sleep beyond the copper, waiting to rise. Along the ridge the Buryats call the Coal Range, oral tradition preserves one of the oldest images of a sealed people. According to epic Uligurs, when the black tribes rebelled against the supreme Tengri, the heavenly ruler did not annihilate them. Instead, he shut them deep inside a cliff and placed over them 3 successive gates, one of iron, one of copper, and one of stone. So long as the living stone breathes, the 2 lower barriers remain immovable. When its breath ceases, all 3 gates will open at once. The earliest written echo of this plot appears in the Buryat Tibetan text of the Gesariad, no later than the 12th century. As the hero approaches the Black Land, he hears 3 times the rumble of iron and copper doors hidden in the mountain. The stone seal is not yet mentioned, but the double metal lock is already in place, several centuries before the first Orthodox missions reached Transbaikalia. In the 1950s, Kori storytellers, preserving an oral tradition, told a researcher an expanded version of the story. Above the iron and the copper lies the breaststone. When it dies, 3 ages will converge, and the imprisoned will emerge. Popov and Komich, working decades earlier, noted the formula without a single Slavonic borrowing and stressed that the elders called it Urgagui Domog, an early pre-book tradition. A map now marks 2 relevant sites, the eastern spurs of the Sayan Mountains and the Copper Cauldron locations deep in the Vilui Taiga. Legends recount a shared structural motif, that Sayan Ridge purportedly conceals the gates, while in Yakutia's Valley of Death, half-submerged copper domes hide one-eyed folk of the Old World, an image we already met among the Scythians. Field notes by Mack and Schrenk from the mid-19th century, 2 centuries before any large-scale mission schools reached the region, contain the phrase, "They will come forth at the cold end of the era," yet make no reference to the Christian or Muslim Last Judgment. Archaeology confirms the layer's independence. Ritual place names in the eastern Sayan show no trace of early Russian settlement, while the underground adits of Copper Hill, dated to the 13th century, match local shamanic stories of a mountain encircled by a copper belt. Therefore, we can state, on firm documentary grounds, that the 3-part schema, iron, copper, living stone, and the expectation of a final release, were already fully formulated in Buryat and adjoining northern epic cycles by no later than the 13th century. Such is the course of the legend before any outside preaching. A sealed people, 2 metal tiers, and the living stone that still locks the seal in place. Should that seal ever break, Buryat storytellers will not look for explanations. They will simply say, the story is fulfilled. The hour of the gates has come. There was a time when the Alexander romance ranked just after the Bible in medieval Europe and was a global bestseller. Hundreds of manuscripts, from Ireland to Sri Lanka, dozens of recensions in Greek, Latin, Arabic, Armenian, Syriac, Ethiopic, Old French, Icelandic, and every one of them preserved the same central scene. Alexander chains the tribes of Gog and Magog behind walls of iron and copper. In Georgian chronicles, he becomes a prophet, in the Ethiopic version, a holy king, and in the Old French Roman d'Alexandre, a tournament hero. Yet the wall against the apocalyptic hordes remains unchanged, like a lead seal beneath the text. Manuscript maps of the 12th, 14th centuries push Gog and Magog to the very margin, the northeastern corner of the Orbis, ringed with a jagged line. Every pilgrim knew this was not the edge of the parchment, but Alexander's grill. Then the age of print arrives. Parisian and Venetian presses adopt the short alpha version, handy, cheap to typeset, and stripped of Gog and Magog, stripped of the wall, leaving only adventures and the love letters of royal daughters. Thus, for the first time, the market format trims the apocalypse. In 16th century France, they issue Vieille Fée d'Alexandre, a 4th reprint in 20 years, again without the sealed nations. Lion book fairs praise the lightened edition, only 300 pages instead of the former 6. Readers receive a gallant Alexander, not an eschatological one. Next comes the Enlightenment. For philosophers, Gog and Magog become childish hyperbole. Diderot already writes of monsters of allegory, and 18th century cartographers fold the jagged frame and label it simply Mons du Caucase. By the 19th century, engravings still feature the wall scene, yet library catalogs now label it Curiosity. Gog and Magog are shifted to the myths section, alongside centaurs and griffins. Then the 20th century in France, the era of action laïque, sees universities purge superstitious material. The romance is reprinted from the 1887 Greek alpha text, again without the wall. In the USSR, Glavlit places apocalyptic language on a special stop list, harmful religious fantasy. Look for a Soviet retelling of Alexander, and you will find dragons and sphinxes, but never Gog and Magog. By mid-century, the legend that 300 years earlier had shaped maps and inspired theologians has almost vanished from public discussion. In universities, it is dismissed as literary hyperbole. Atlases relegate Gog and Magog to the folklore margin. And in cinema, Alexander spars not with forces of darkness, but with his own generals. Pause and listen. The sound of that wall is barely audible now. Once it dictated the routes on the map, today it is lost beneath the rustle of slim, lightweight editions. If Alexander's walls truly guard whatever lies beyond the world's edge, then we have all but forgotten them, and walls prefer to be forgotten. With that, the knot draws tight. It no longer matters whose name stood beneath the order to seal the iron with copper, whether it was Alexander or some king forgotten by the chroniclers. Nor does it matter where the first seam was laid, Caucasus, Altai, or the Eastern Sion. The legend's pull rests elsewhere. Before us stands an ancient warning about a civilization of ritualized violence, entombed in rock, beneath permafrost, or in unknown networks of hidden subterranean ecosystems. Millennia of confinement have likely turned it into a culture of total psychosis, built on a cult of vengeance. In Islamic hadiths, these peoples drink the Sea of Galilee dry without pausing, so their number must be counted not in millions, but in billions, even hundreds of billions. If we assume that they come out, it won't be a war, it will be a judgment. The Qur'an is brutally literal. When they are released, they will surge down from every height. Put the verse into geodesic terms. Mountain ranges are fused fractures of the lithosphere, and every height means all continental ridges at once. Any breach in the ceiling contour would trigger not a local collapse, but a cascading planetary release. thousands of valves opening at once. Ancient sources across continents repeat the same pattern. A hostile world locked beneath the crust, sealed by metal, awaiting its hour. The Middle Ages took such omens seriously. Even the Alexander Romance, the most successful novel of late antiquity, treated it not as myth, but as memory. Modern presses trimmed, redacted, and quietly shelved the legend, striking out the wall, blacking out forbidden names, and relegating the apocalyptic thread to a footnote. It simply had no place in the modern mind. A fear you can't sell, an enemy you can't negotiate with, a threat you can't neutralize. Thus we forgot the most widespread story of the last 2 millennia, a point where scriptures, epics, and folk memory converge. The sealed ones, the wall, the rites, the end of the age. It shatters the picture of a rational world. It tears away the illusion of control. It reminds us, evil was not banished. It was only locked and forgotten. What remains are abridged, worn, digitized fragments, shards of the glass coffin where the memory of an ancient terror sleeps. Truth is never erased by accident. It is painted over out of necessity. With the Alexander Romance, whole pieces of collective memory were excised because the parallels were too precise. One thread linked the Qur'an, the Bible, the Talmud, and other traditions into a single story of the sealed ones. It activates an archetype of fear that cannot be managed. This is no myth of a hero slaying a dragon, but a challenge to the very fundamental order of the world. People could sense this is not a fairy tale, but a warning. Not an accident of chance, but personal vengeance from those we forgot, who have not forgotten us. Listen to how softly yet stubbornly the earth whispers, and how stubbornly we refuse to hear. At the bottom of the Clarion-Clipperton fracture zone, 4 kilometers deep in perfect darkness, instruments detected dark oxygen. Oxygen forming by itself and tripling in concentration within 48 hours. Scientific guesses point to microbes or sediment shifts, but the phenomenon remains unreplicated and unexplained. Over Antarctica, the Anita antennas catch particles shooting upward from inside the planet, as though the core were stitching radio pulses through the crust, reminding us that while we search the skies, we still scarcely know what lies beneath our feet. The Kola Super Deep Borehole, 12,262 meters, hydrogen and boiling water burst from the shaft, and in granite 6 kilometers below sea level lie films of plankton. The Witwatersrand Basin wrecks textbook charts. Instead of the normal 25 Celsius per kilometer, only 9. Where drillers expected 100 degrees Celsius, they hit a cool 60. Beneath Lake Vostok, 4 kilometers under an ice shield, live active bacteria. And the whole globe hums with the steady earth hum, even when no earthquakes strike. Now remember, our seismographs are not CAT scanners. They read only the loudest echoes. One oceanic station per hundreds of thousands of square kilometers is a gaping hole in the net. Anything under a kilometer across or tucked along strata slips into acoustic shadow. We have drilled 0.2% of Earth's radius, like piercing 2 millimeters of a 1 meter globe with a needle. The rest we model, infer, average. So when we say there are no vast voids inside the Earth, we are really saying the layer model doesn't need them to explain the signals we know. That is not the same as they are not there. The planet shows anomalies and we write them off as noise. Yet noise is simply what we do not yet know how to read. So how could people survive underground? A unique natural complex or a phenomenon that our geology does not yet know about? Well, we don't know. We have no answer. Science is strong precisely because tomorrow it will refute itself and add another line to the ledger of the unexplained. Every week, science overturns itself and finds something new. Dark oxygen, anomalous neutrinos, living cells in Proterozoic rock. Each fact makes the prophecy of the sealed ones sound a little louder.